All right, good afternoon. While the panel is still chatting a little bit, I'm going to get us started because we just have an hour. Welcome to today's campus conversation. This is the sixth and final conversation for this academic year. By the way, my name is Susan Poser. I'm the provost here. These conversations have given us the opportunity to come together. I don't think they realize their mic is live. To come together and learn about and consider the issues of the day that are impacting our lives. Today's panel, What's Going On and Why? The First Amendment and Speech on Campus, will be followed next Wednesday, April 12th at noon by an open forum on the same issue, also held here at Student Center West. The question of what limits there are on free speech on a college campus have been around for a long time and surface in different ways and for different reasons over time. In just the 1 year that I have been at UIC, these issues have arisen several times, including last March when then-candidate Donald Trump was scheduled to speak on our campus, and more recently, just a couple of weeks ago, when anti-Semitic posters, which also implicated other groups, were found on campus. It seems then that the time is ripe here at UIC to engage in a discussion about these issues, with the goal of respecting and encouraging the free and open exchange of ideas while maintaining the diverse and inclusive community that UIC prides itself on. And this is no small task when there is so much to talk about and so many different views on some very difficult issues. But it is critical that we continue to figure out how to make it work. So today we have a panel of members of the UIC community who are going to engage in a discussion with Professor Sheldon Nahmod. Professor Nahmod is a distinguished professor of law at the Chicago-Kent School of Law at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Professor Nahmod is an expert in constitutional law and civil rights. He has authored several books and numerous articles and has argued cases in front of the United States Supreme Court. There's more, but I'm making this short for everybody. Our panel members are Rabbi Seth Winberg of the Levine Hillel Center at UIC, Lori Barcliffe-Baptista, Director of the African American Culture Center at UIC, Rosa Cabrera, Director of the Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center at UIC, Megan Carney, Director of the Gender and Sexuality Center at UIC, and Professor Nadine Neighbor, Director of the Arab American Culture Center at UIC. We will begin with Professor Nahmod, who will provide us with some background about the First Amendment, followed by a discussion which I will moderate. And if we have time, we will take questions at the end. Professor Nahmod.
Thank you, Provost. I appreciate it. Is the mic on? Are you all able to hear me reasonably well? I'm Sheldon Nahmod, and I'll be talking about the First Amendment. If you want to put it in these terms, since I'm speaking only for 15 minutes, I will indecently expose you to the First Amendment. Let's start with basics. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Notice the language. It refers to Congress, but Supreme Court jurisprudence has applied the First Amendment to state and local governments as well as to the federal government, but not to private parties or private institutions. So the University of Illinois at Chicago, for example, is covered by the First Amendment, while my school, IIT, Chicago-Kent College of Law, being private, is not. Like the Constitution in general, the First Amendment is a product of the Enlightenment, which deals with self-government on the basis of reason, not on the basis of passion, not on the basis of religion or tradition necessarily. In order to understand some of the basics of the First Amendment, and keep in mind, please, I'm not giving anybody legal advice. You consult a lawyer if you have specific questions. I want to tell you briefly what the three major theories of the First Amendment are, and then get into some of the details, giving examples from the UIC and other campuses. Specifically, the major theory, or one of the three major theories, is the marketplace of ideas. Think of John Stuart Mill and his On Liberty, something similar to that, where the best test of truth is its ability to be accepted in the marketplace. This is modeled on laissez-faire and on scientific experimentation. Under this approach, there is no hierarchy of speech. No kind of speech is more important than any other kind of speech, and the government's role is one of neutrality. Stay out altogether. A second theory of the First Amendment is tied into the Constitution, which is self-government. We need the First Amendment in order to educate ourselves through reason and practical judgment about how to govern ourselves. Notice from a self-government theory or perspective of free speech, there is in fact a hierarchy of speech, and that is political speech would rank at the very top, and other kinds of speech might rank below that in terms of free speech value. Here too, the government's role is one of neutrality, and underlying both of these is what you might characterize as the avoidance of government suppression. We don't want the government intervening in the marketplace of ideas and intervening in self-government. The government serves us. We do not serve the government. That's the theoretical background of free speech. Let's get into some more practical considerations. First Amendment decisions are the outcome of three factors: the what, namely the content of the speech, the how, the medium of the speech, oral, written, internet, TV, radio, as well as the where, the forum question. Where does the speech take place? And this will be particularly important in connection with UIC, which is a public educational institution. Notice that a rock group is missing from this list of the what and the where and the how. Free speech has costs. It has costs, as we will see, and like other constitutional rights, the First Amendment, and this is important, is not absolute. There is no such thing as an absolute constitutional right for individuals. Many non-lawyers don't understand that. I'm telling you now, that's a takeaway point. If you learn nothing else from this little presentation, I hope you pick up on that one. So let's talk briefly about the what, because certain kinds of speech are actually unprotected by the First Amendment. For example, threats. An attempt to intimidate by the threat of force or violence, which silences people, that is unprotected by the First Amendment. Government can punish that, which means the UIC could punish it as well. Obscene speech is unprotected by the First Amendment utterly, as is child pornography. Unprotected by the First Amendment. There is an aspect of free speech doctrine involving the hostile audience. Suppose a speaker is addressing an audience which is hostile to his or her message and tries to shout down or stop the speaker from speaking. The Supreme Court has held, intriguingly, that there is an affirmative duty on the part of government to protect the speaker from the hostile audience, and that government duty is discharged only when it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to protect the speaker from the audience. Hate speech, what about that in terms of the what the content of speech. Hate speech is speech directed at a historically oppressed religion or racial minority with the intent to insult or demean. It undermines social attitudes and beliefs, isolates its targets and intends to silence them. It also traumatizes. What has Supreme Court jurisprudence said about hate speech? Well, the short answer is, and it can be made considerably more complicated, is that the government is not allowed to regulate hate speech as such, unlike the situation in Western Europe, which has a very different, unfortunate historical experience from us in the United States. And this is tied to the marketplace of ideas and especially self-government. The Enlightenment assumption is that people are ultimately persuaded by reason, even though obviously emotions and passions play roles in political decision-making. Offending people, hurting people psychologically is not a sufficient justification for the government regulation of speech. And there's also a very important free speech consideration here, the opportunity for counter-speech. No matter how vicious or nasty or unappealing the speech is, we assume that there is room for counter-speech which might counter the original unfortunate hate speech. So, some general principles: government may not suppress or regulate speech with which it disagrees. It may also not exclude certain subjects from public discussion. We have a posture of suspicion. So UIC students, for example, cannot be punished solely because of expressing their political views. Faculty are a little more complicated because they are employees of UIC. We can talk about that later, but they don't have the same free speech rights in this regard as students may have. So that's the what. Now the how. Speaking, writing, demonstrations, traditional media include oral speech, writing, demonstrations, and the like, and these are ordinarily accorded the maximum protection depending on where they take place and when. As we'll see in a moment, demonstrations may be subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and you'll be glad to know, you probably know this already, that the Supreme Court has expanded First Amendment protection to the Internet, so that government attempts to regulate the Internet are generally found to violate the First Amendment. Practical takeaway from this, there is no constitutional right to say what you want and however, with the medium that is, you want to say it. This applies to public university. You can't speak up, for example, in the middle of a science class to deliver a political message. You can't have a sound truck on the campus in the middle of the day with political messages, and especially in the middle of the night. Finally, the where question. Remember the what, the how, the medium of communication, and the where question. Maximum First Amendment protection is given to speakers in what we lawyer types call traditional public forums, such as streets and parks. Almost as protected is free speech in designated public forums, such as public universities, which are voluntarily opened up to students and faculty for discussion of all kinds, although not necessarily opened up to outsiders. Outsiders do not necessarily have First Amendment access, you understand, to a public university. Although in a public university, certain places can be designated for free speech activities. Certain places might be severely restricted. Dorms, for example, maybe the library. Those places, because of where they are, might possibly be regulable by government, and this depends in part on the medium. So, whether we have speech in a traditional public forum such as streets or parks, or designated ones such as public universities, Permits can be required, and as I said earlier, there may be reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. After all, you can't generally hold 2 demonstrations at the same time in the same place. You've got to have restrictions on those. There is no First Amendment right to demonstrate, therefore, wherever you want and whenever you want on the UIC campus, any more that there is a right to demonstrate where you want and when you want on streets or in parks. Permits may be appropriate. Now, as I finish up, I want to make an important point that sometimes even we lawyers don't get, but it's especially important for non-lawyers to get. I've been talking about the legality and constitutionality using free speech principles. I want to say something, and I hope this is one of your takeaways. Just because you have a constitutional right to do something, just because what you want to do or say is legal, it does not follow by any means that it is moral to do so. I'll say that again. Constitutionality and morality. Constitutionality does not determine morality. It does not at all. You hope there is a connection, but there is no necessary connection. So even if you have a constitutional right to engage in hate speech, it does not follow that it is moral. Or to use another controversial example, I hope the women forgive me for this, just because it is constitutional to decide to have an abortion in the first 2 trimesters of your pregnancy, it does not follow, this is your own decision, that it is moral to do so. Constitutionality is not the same thing as morality. There are imperatives of citizenship. Citizenship gives rise to certain norms that you should comply with since you are a citizen, and morality does the same thing. So that's how I finish with my preliminary comments. I hope there are a few takeaways, and I appreciate your being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nahmod. So now we're going to have very brief comments by each of our panelists, and then after that engage in a conversation about the First Amendment. And so we will start with Megan Carney, who's the director of the Gender and Sexuality Center at UIC.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Terrific. Thank you so much, Provost, for the invitation to be here. I wanted to say a few words about the centers and then dive into my specific example. 4 of us up here are representatives of the Centers for Cultural Understanding and Social Change, and for those of you who don't know us, we're in academic affairs under the Office of Diversity, reporting up to the Provost. We brought a lot of materials today that are outside on the tables, and so I hope you'll take a moment, if you haven't had a chance yet, to look at some of the programs we're doing that directly relate to this and many other issues for the campus. Each of the centers, some of us are represented, we're not all here today, we each have unique locations and identities, but we also have a lot of overlapping work that we do, overlapping histories and shared concerns. And we do a lot of collective programming and take a lot of direct collective action as a result of that. Each of us is going to cite different examples of how instances around free speech and actions that we've taken around that have occurred on the campus in our recent history together. So I wanted to start us off. Professor Nahmod, thank you for giving us that outline around the what, the how, and the where, and I'll just use that structure to kind of share the example that I have, which is an instance of anti-gay or homophobic, transphobic information being distributed via leaflets in the Student Center East on our campus. And this has happened on a couple of different occasions in my time here. And I want to tell you about one story in particular. I was sitting in my office on a day and I got a phone call from a staff member who works in the copy center in the Student Center who said, something's getting passed out by the escalators and I'm really upset about it. And I don't think this should be happening on our campus and I just don't know what to do. And as we started looking into it, I think someone else had called campus police And, was told, well, we can't tell people to leave, it's a public space. So we came up with a counter narrative, or as Professor Nahmod said, counter speech option to directly respond to that action. So we had some cards already in our office from a visit of a pretty homophobic, transphobic church that came to campus a couple of years ago, and they were bright yellow cards, and they said something along the lines of, hate has no home here, or no hate at UIC, and then had some affirming messages printed on the back, and had all the information about the Gender and Sexuality Center included. So we grabbed the cards, and a bunch of us from the center went over to Student Center East, and we just stood on the other end of the escalators and we passed these out. And we had a lot of exchanges with students and staff and faculty who were using the escalators that day about the relief they felt seeing us there, because it was really confounding that that would be happening on our campus, especially because we discovered an outside organization. And we were unclear about what that arrangement was and how that was permissible and if it was. So I guess I just wanted to say, I'm curious, some questions that came up to me from the talk are, what exactly constitutes a threat? Is that physical? Is that, this kind of microaggression? Is it leafletting? At what point would that constitute a threat? And then also, in terms of designated areas and outside entities, at what point do we require a permit for an outside group that comes to campus? Or could we say, who invited you to come to campus? And does that give us grounds to determine what might be distributed? Since the 2016 election results and the ensuing rise of hate crimes across the country, the centers gathered together in fall, and we sent out a collective statement kind of standing against, rejecting racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and other expressions of bigotry and discrimination. And we since have created a new card, and I brought a bunch of these today. They're the mint green cards that you'll see out on the table. So I invite you to take those with you. And it's got a statement that sort of affirms our values, who we are as centers for the campus, what the spaces, the safe and brave spaces that we're continuing to cultivate for intersectional communities working together, and kind of inviting people into that process. So this is one opportunity for you to take away, if you experience something like that, to sort of reclaim public space with a counter narrative that can be used. And I think that's what I want to leave with today, and pass on to Larry.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker will be Lori Barcliffe Batista, who's the director of the African American Cultural Center.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to focus most of my speaking a little bit about the how. And so I'll start with the what. So the summer of 2016 was forcefully punctuated by global, national, and local instances of violence. Social media hastened our grasp of the tragedy of the Pulse nightclub shooting and the murders of Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and 5 police officers in Dallas, Texas. Over the 4th of July weekend, 62 people were shot in Chicago, 4 were killed, and July 2016 marked the deadliest July in Chicago in more than 10 years with 65 homicides. In addition to participating in a number of ongoing demonstrations, petitions, protests, and rallies, as well as issuing public statements, members of UIC community gathered in healing circles, dialogue, and quiet reflection to process but also respond in various ways to some of the injustices that took place over the summer. The African American Cultural Center responded to the violence and also the increasingly unsettling political rhetoric of summer 2005 by initiating a site-specific participatory arts project. So this is the how. We initiated the quilting project. The quilt is here with us today. While quilting has its roots in a number of cultural traditions, we especially invoke its African American genealogy as part of the Centers for Cultural Understanding and Social Change's commitment to programming around the theme of remedies for this year. And I should say many of the 7 cultural centers use arts-based social practice to engage around issues in addition to dialogue and some of the other methods that we use. So completed during the fall of 2016, the project convened a multi-ethnic, multiracial cohort of campus and community stakeholders to make what would be known as a friendship or album quilt. The quilt, which is titled Remedies, Love, Unity, and Peace, is comprised of 39 8x10 panels and one 24x30 panel 62 faculty, staff, students, and African American Cultural Center community partners participated in quilt-making workshops at the Cultural Center facilitated by a Chicago fabric artist and educator, Jim Smoot. African American Cultural Center staff as well helped to coordinate inclusion of many of our campus partners to participate. And I'd say the Remedies quilt is really a product of our collective efforts to create what we call the summer safe and brave spaces that honor diversity of views, and again, represents another outlet for sharing out our responses to these things.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori. Our next speaker is Rabbi Seth Winberg from UIC's Hillel.
Thanks for the invitation to be here today. I've been getting asked many times in the last couple of weeks, what's the big deal about these anti-Semitic flyers? Why is this bothering Jewish students so much? And so I hope this will help clarify. I'm the director of the Hillel on campus, which is a non-denominational pluralistic Jewish student organization. The scriptural source for evil speech, being a Jewish moral and spiritual sin, is cursed be the one who harms his or her neighbor in secret, from the book of Deuteronomy. And it's hard for me not to associate posting anti-Semitic flyers or other forms of biased hate speech in secret when no one is looking. It's hard for me not to associate that with this verse in the Torah. Perhaps the most objectionable content of the flyers was the Holocaust inversion in one of them. The flyer compares the condition of the Palestinians in Gaza with Jews in Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp. The comparison between the Jewish state and those who perpetrated the greatest and largest act of anti-Semitism in world history is a biased and intentionally hurtful comparison. Holocaust inversion is not a form of legitimate criticism of the Jewish state. It's a charge that is purposefully directed at Jews, claiming that Jews should not be seen as victims of Nazi crimes, but as Nazi perpetrators. Such comparisons also serve to diminish the significance and uniqueness of the Holocaust. In short, making such comparisons is an act of hostility towards Jews. Now, posing the question of whether a specific act of speech is legal according to the laws of our country strikes me as an acceptably low bar. For my students at Hillel and for all of us here, I would encourage a more spiritual frame of reference. What speech helps build a society of respect and harmony? According to my ancient Jewish tradition, corrupt or evil speech mortally damages three people: the one who says it, the one being talked about, and the one who listens to it. Jewish tradition also teaches that it is better to throw yourself into a fiery furnace than to embarrass another person in public. Gossip is a moral and spiritual sin according to Jewish tradition, even when the gossip is true. All of us at a university, chancellors, provosts, professors, deans, students, have to confront evil speech. University campuses make us particularly vulnerable to evil speech because at a university, freedom of speech is cherished. It's perhaps the only value that we can all agree upon fervently. But spreading lies in order to hurt people is a perversion of the ideal of free speech. Judaism aspires to a vision of society based on careful, deliberate, constructive speech. That's what my tradition teaches, that all sorts of speech, which the laws of the United States allows, are morally and spiritually wrong. That words can be used as weapons by those who want to cause others pain. When people speak badly about other people, they erode the integrity of the community that we are trying to build together. My question for you, Professor Nahmod, is what advice would you give to a student about how to cultivate a commitment to citizenship?
Thank you, Rabbi Winberg. Our next speaker is Rosa Cabrera, who is the director of the Latino Cultural Center at UIC.
Thank you. Although the First Amendment protects speech no matter how offensive and hurtful its content, consequences of hate speech on campus are very real for students in particular. When it interferes with their ability to fully participate in community life here in UIC. My personal observation is that they feel threatened, undermine and reminded that their struggle to fully participate in society is an ongoing and unjust exercise. And these feelings and reactions work on a timetable that calls for urgent interventions. And since the cultural centers are designated by the students as safe and brave spaces, we are bounded to create these very timely responses or counter speeches to be able to support them. Responses to hate speeches for us offer opportunities, and I want to emphasize this, for greater inquiry into reasons for bigotry. And this can bring a sense of safety as people feel more empowered with knowledge and tools to counter hate. And this is something that we're talking more and more about when these incidents happen, is to sit down and, as painful as it is to try to figure out why is this bigotry. And I think we feel that, and we have seen it, that as students find out more, do more of this inquiry, that they feel more empowered to be able to then form counter speeches that are more informed, if we can call it their ways. I can share a couple of incidents on campus that prompted a series of urgent responses from the Latino Cultural Center, but also the other center. The first was in 2013, when a poster in the LCC was vandalized with an anti-undocumented slur. And you can see all of this on the table outside on display. Right away, the students worked with us and other cultural centers to develop a series of responses to reaffirm their identity as immigrant and, as more important, as undocumented. This was very important to them. And also that they were members of the UIC community. They created a display with the vandalized poster saying, "This will not stop us." We presented a series of public programs called Undocumented Families Relationship in the U.S. that brought in faculty to talk about particular ethnographic studies. A series of out of the shadow into the street rallies took place in the quad. So in a sense, they felt more empowered and a need to come out and say, I am undocumented and I'm unafraid and this is who I am. We hosted an outdoor exhibit called I Define Myself, Undocumented and Unafraid, that traveled from the whole house to various cultural centers, outdoor spaces, ending in BSB, with the Gender and Sexuality Center, where some of the largest posters were vandalized also. And another rally had to be organized in order to respond to this. The second example that I wanted to talk about is what we call the almost Trump visit, right? Which never happened, which left many of the students, staff, and faculty involved in this process with a lot of difficult questions on how the university can be open to all opinions, popular and unpopular, while protecting the well-being of targeted people on campus. And this is key because the way that we might define threat and the way that the university defines threat is very different than the way the students define threat. And again, this is a lot of these conversations about defining this. After the almost Trump visit, we held an arts-based civic dialogue at the center, and we also had a circle to share afterthoughts about what it meant to be part of organizing this protest. And also, right before the presidential inauguration on National Day, students came together, and we hosted an open studio using the arts as a tool to really get the students feel better about what was happening, and also talk about their feelings and their own stories. And so these counter-species responses have allowed all of us to do a lot of storytelling, to stimulate discussions on free speech and what it means to be part of a diverse campus community and what this diversity brings to us, right? So the beauty of diversity, we all know that it's necessary to maintain human creativity, but on the other hand, it brings a lot of challenges, right? So how do we mediate these two? And also, it has created a lot of opportunities to form alliance across issues and identities, as they have created this sense of safety and belonging for students, but also for cultural workers on this campus, because it also affects all of us, faculty and staff.
Thank you, Rosa. And our final speaker from the panel is Professor Nadine Neighbor, who's the director of the Arab American Cultural Center at UIC.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to start by sharing a greeting from Mark Martel with you. He's the director of the Asian American Resource and Cultural Center, and he couldn't make it today. So I'm first going to set up the context of free speech for Arab and Muslim Americans in the context of the period, especially starting with the U.S. war on terror after the horrific attacks of September 11th, with George Bush's famous quote, "Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists," that we all recall, I'm sure. And to think about that as a racial discourse that associates terrorism with people who are perceived to be Arab or Muslim. So we need to take that discourse into consideration because over the years it's legitimized the criminalization of people who look Arab or Muslim, and also helps justify hate speech and hate violence against them. In a recent incident this semester at UIC, a man approached a freshman Muslim woman wearing the hijab, a student, a freshman. She was walking through the engineering passageway on her own. He yelled at her, "You have a bomb in your bag," and she was all alone, and other slurs involving references to Islam. Arabs or Muslims who peacefully express viewpoints that are critical of war on terror-related policies, whether it's anti-Muslim racism or the U.S. war on Iraq, are disproportionately targeted or criminalized within this environment. So basically, if you're not only perceived to be Arab or Muslim, but you're also an activist and criticizing racism or war, you're going to be disproportionately targeted because, then there's that association between activists and support for terrorism, because criticizing U.S. government policy is equated with being un-American. If you're thinking within that logic of you're with us or with the terrorists, there's no other option. So Arab and Muslim students across the U.S. are aware that they or their parents could be targeted with hate speech in public space, or charged with terrorism-related charges, or put through trials based on secret evidence that they will never see, or that their neighborhoods can be or are already under surveillance or being visited by the FBI without any evidence of criminal activity. So how does this matter to the First Amendment? Well, these institutionalized policies related to the war on terror, whether it's surveillance, the use of secret evidence, etc., have produced a culture of fear and repression, whereby our students and our communities can be afraid to enact their constitutionally protected free speech rights out of fear of criminalization, or of simply being seen as un-American, or being targeted by Islamophobic groups that scapegoat Arab and Muslim individuals as potential terrorists or terrorist supporters, or un-American. So it's important to think about that level of fear that's community-wide, and that also helps explain why there was a strong reaction to the posters, not only because of the horrific and absolutely unacceptable anti-Semitism that the posters promoted, but also that the posters were partly blamed on Arabs and Muslims, as they were presented as the Arabs and Muslims were the authors of the flyers, as well as Black Lives Matter movement. And so, that's taking place in an environment where Arab and Muslims are already scapegoated for, being the bad guys. And so the idea that, of course, the posters would need an investigation, and that already creates a sense of fear. So just to close up, how do we respond on the ground on campus? We agree with the theme that the way to respond to hate speech is more speech, and we do that through community building and building unity across campus and building strength and visibility and a voice for our Arab and Muslim students in diversity efforts across campus. We support students through positive, uplifting cultural and artistic events that help build community visibility and safe spaces. The woman who experienced the hate incident, she came to our center, and one of our staff worked with her through art therapy, and she ended up writing a poem about her experience. And she and her poetry will be featured at a campus event tonight called Rise Up. There's a flyer outside. And so what we do is we bring communities together to basically use the arts for healing and for building communities. So we'll have an event where poets are coming to work with a group of people to write poetry together and create messaging for campus unity together with themes like hate has no home here. So for Professor Nahmod, how can our discussions of the law account for differential access to free speech? What do you think of the idea that not everyone is equally protected under the First Amendment?
Good. Thank you, Nadine. So I think as a sort of a side note to the First Amendment, I think one thing that we have learned here today is the strength and dedication of our cultural centers and our Hillel and their desire to support our students and our whole campus and all the kinds of work that they're doing. So I want to just publicly thank them for that. Not that the professor needs any summary, but I sort of picked up three themes here. One being what constitutes a threat, and how can something really not be a threat when the people who are subject to the speech feel genuinely and authentically threatened. The second one is this idea of counter speech, which I think is hard to argue with in our culture. It's really ingrained, but as Dr. Neighbor pointed out, some people's counter speech is much more risky than other people's, and so how do you account for that, and how do you deal with that differential? And then the third one that I heard was how what Rabbi Winberg said, how do we help our students become good citizens when the First Amendment bar is the floor, not the ceiling? And how do we teach them to become productive people and part of community when you can pretty much say anything you want most of the time? So it would be nice to have a conversation about this, but we will let Professor Nahmod have the first word on that.
Only about 7 or 8 impossible questions. I was taking notes.
Might want to put the little closer. Yeah.
Several of the speakers gave us terrific examples of counter speech, and I can only applaud those examples and tell them to keep on doing it. With respect to a question that somebody raised about outside organizations, there is no necessary First Amendment right of outside organizations right of access to a public university, but we've got an interesting public university here. It's an urban public university, and streets intersected and the like. So unless regulations or restrictions could be very carefully drafted to keep outsiders out, I think that might be asking for more First Amendment problems than it would be worth. I am just not sure. What's a threat? That's an excellent question. The Supreme Court has told us there are two aspects to true threats. One is that the speaker has to intend that the person on the receiving end be intimidated by the possible threat of violence. Secondly, on the receiving end, it must be received that way, and a reasonable person must have interpreted or received it that way. So somebody with a particularly thin skin would not necessarily be able to say this is a threat. So you need both of those in order to have a true threat, and without both of those, Supreme Court just handed down a case a couple of years ago involving apparent threats made to the ex-wife of some crazy guy over the internet. His name was Elonis, E-L-O-N-I-S. and the Supreme Court struck down his conviction because he didn't supposedly intend that his ex-wife be threatened, even if she was, and probably any one of us would have been threatened or felt threatened as well. Sometimes a threat can be conveyed just by your physical presence. I'm a relatively short person. If somebody comes up to me who is 6'6" and calls me, what, my mother was from Poland, my dad was from Syria, you dirty Polak, or you dirty Arab, or something of that sort, in my face, that could be a threat, besides being fighting words, which is another legal terminology. Now, there's going to hate speech now on my little list. There is an advantage in not prohibiting hate speech. You know who your enemies are. That is not to be underestimated. You know who your political enemies are. Rabbi asked a terrific question. How do you cultivate a commitment to citizenship? Well, I'm a first-generation American, and I really love and appreciate this country. So the question is, how do you develop, with all its flaws, by the way, and there are many, how do you develop an attachment? Well, an attachment is both intellectual and emotional. You've got to learn American history. I'm sorry, you've got to learn it. I don't know if it's required anymore. You've got to learn about this country, its ups and its downs. You've also got to learn, at least as a layperson, not necessarily going to law school, about the Constitution. You've got to know about the Second World War, during which this country saved the world. You know, there's something important there, again, with all of this country's flaws. So it's learning as well as figuring out what's happened in American history and connecting to it. There are amazing stories there. The damaged poster, which was an example, that can be punished if it was a student who did it, maybe even if it was a non-student who did it, because the legal category would be trespass to personal property. You can't commit vandalism on somebody else's property, so you've got a little legal handle in that situation. What should the university do? University has an obligation as a university, as well as having a moral obligation, to speak out expressly against inappropriate speech, even if the First Amendment protects it. You have to, at one and the same time, I would think, support free speech values and say, regardless of those free speech values, we think that what this speech was reprehensible, and it should not be accepted as the norm on our campus. Now let me finish up, because we were talking about anti-Muslim, anti-Arab slurs. When government officials engage in these slurs, and unfortunately our current president has not been the best example for us, when a government official engage in these slurs, it is especially troubling because it may reflect government policy. On the one hand, the government policy can sometimes, when implemented, be challenged in the courts, but it also encourages bigots. And that is another adverse effect of government officials speaking out in a bigoted way. Now, I saved one of the hardest questions for last, and that is differential access to free speech. Does anybody here own a newspaper? No. Is anybody here a millionaire or a multi-millionaire? We have to be honest. One of the flaws with the marketplace of ideas approach is that money buys you greater access to the marketplace and greater impact. It simply does that. However, the Supreme Court, in a bunch of cases, the campaign financing cases and the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court has said government should play no role in equalizing access to the marketplace of ideas. That's what the Supreme Court has said, adopting a kind of laissez-faire approach to political speech. You've got the money, in effect. You've got more political speech available to you and more of an opportunity to influence. So, given that First Amendment structure, you've got to fight very hard, and it's what you said earlier, groups joining together to overcome the speech, to engage in counter-speech against the very powerful groups. The assumption of most of us studying the First Amendment is that it's probably better to do that than to get the government involved in regulating speech. Because sometimes governments have their own hidden agendas, and maybe not so hidden, and sometimes if the government's agenda is on your side this year, next year the government's agenda will be on a side opposite of yours. So you've always got to be suspicious of government agendas, even though we count on government very often to protect us.
Thank you very much. Does anybody on the panel want to respond to that or ask a follow-up question or...
Yeah, we
No.
spent through all not consistent with free speech values.
Megan, you want to exercise your free speech? You just look like you were... You don't have to.
I guess one thing that came up to me that I don't want to take time away from what other people might be thinking, but I was curious about all of the effort we put into crafting non-discrimination statements for our university and other protective clauses around who's here and who's included and all of that. And I wondered if there's some overlaps between those territories.
Can you be a little more specific? Are you suggesting possibly, as some scholars have, although they're a distinct minority, that equal protection, equality values should play a role in free speech jurisprudence? Is that what you're getting at, or did I put too fancy of a gloss on that? Because the Supreme Court has basically said equality, no constitutional guarantee of equal access necessarily. You fight with what you have. So are you saying something else?
No, that's helpful.
The question that I heard, I think I heard, was we spend a lot of time creating anti-discrimination policies and policies about community inclusion, and we have cultural centers and so on and so forth. We do all these things, and it seems sort of maybe to say in a exaggerated way, pointless if people can still go around and say this stuff and create problems that go against these values of anti-discrimination.
Well, why would it be pointless? Because when government enacts anti-discrimination legislation, the government is speaking. And the government is speaking in a way which many people think is very favorable speech. And when government speaks, as I was indicating earlier, that sends a very powerful message. The question is, would you rather have government speak in favor of anti-discrimination or have government not speak at all and just leave it up to the vagaries of political organization and the like? And government speaks. Government has spoken positively in many areas of the law. And government does have its own right to speak. That's why we select certain government or certain political parties, because they speak on our behalf, sometimes for good and sometimes not so.
And perhaps the other response is also that there's a difference between a speech and an act, and they certainly protect against anti-discriminatory acts.
Oh yes. I'm sorry. I probably should have or could have said at the outset that we are talking about speech, or at the most about speech that's embedded in certain kinds of conduct. Demonstrations are obviously conduct, but they are communicated conduct. They are expressive conduct. A punch in the mouth is not protected by the First Amendment, even if it is effected by someone who disagrees with what the other person is saying. That is not protected. Murder, assassination is not protected, not at all covered by the First Amendment. It is an act that can be prohibited separately, regardless of the actor's motives. So thank you for...
Yeah, but there's clearly a gray area there, right?
Only in cases involving symbolic speech, burning a draft card, for example, or burning a flag. There is a complicated free speech test involving symbolic speech, but we don't really need to get into that right now.
Yeah. Anybody else on the panel want to say anything to speak before we see if there are any questions? We've got about 5 minutes, and I will say that I know that Rabbi Winberg has to run out of here right at 1. He is dealing with a lot of student issues today. Anybody? Yep. Anybody have a question? Yeah, Robert. Go ahead.
My question concerns restriction of free speech by. My question concerns on the restrictions of free speech by academic boycotts as a way of shutting down speech. The AUP has taken a position in opposition to academic boycotts as a matter of principle. So my question to the panel is an academic boycott ever permissible? And my question to Professor Nahmod is whether opposition to a boycott by a university president or official might be construed as prior restraint of free speech.
Should I start off with the last question? University officials who speak out, for example, against an academic boycott, and that was really your first question, but it's propriety, but that would not be a prior restraint. A prior restraint is a licensing scheme whereby before you speak, you have to get permission from the government official to speak. So this technically is not a prior restraint at all. And I indicated earlier, university officials can speak out on various issues, even if it turns out to be controversial. Now about academic boycotts, generally, leaving aside questions of constitutionality, it seems to me that an academic boycott, whether it's directed at South Africa, whether it's directed against Israel, whether it's directed against Arab countries, an academic boycott which singles out professors from particular universities, from particular countries, is antithetical to the values of the university. It deprives students within the university of competing viewpoints. Students may want to invite somebody to speak, and I think there is a serious political and educational issue with that. Is there a free speech right to argue for a boycott? Sure, you have a free speech right to argue for a boycott. Is there a free speech right to argue against a boycott? Yes. But when you have one, regardless of whom it is directed against, what country, what religion, what nationality, antithetical to university values. This may not be comfortable for some people, but that is my firm view, and I'd like to think I'm even-handed about it. I would even extend it to what was done decades ago with South Africa. You know, as evil as the South African regime.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, so much for your time being here. I just have one quick comment and then a question. My first comment is that while I understand the illustrative impact of using abortion as a moral question, I would encourage you to perhaps come up with a different example to illustrate that point in a room where there are people who have to make that choice, which is incredibly difficult. And that's not actually what I want to talk about. That's a good thing.
Good, but I did, remember something. Just because a person makes a legal argument, this happens to me in my con law classes. One of the things I do in my con law class when we get to Roe v. Wade is to push back on it, legally, to push back on it. And some students say in their evaluations, Professor Nahmod is anti-feminist. And that's outrageous. I'm trying to teach them to think. So you've got to be very, very careful. I am a strong supporter of abortion.
That's fantastic.
But that's not, it shouldn't matter whether I'm a strong supporter or not when I told you that just because you have a legal right to burn a flag, just because you have a legal right to engage in have an abortion, it doesn't necessarily follow that that is a moral decision for you.
And this is actually a great example of what I want to talk about, because I want us to sort of think about, perhaps, or maybe some people on the panel, perhaps even you, Professor, could respond to how we can think about protected free speech when the mechanism that is theoretically doing that production is also targeting students who are, and people who are read as Muslim, Arab, South Asian. So like, how do we think about protection in that context where the state or the government that is supposed to be protecting that speech is also specifically targeting and surveilling people who are trying to use that theoretical right?
Who was that question for?
Anyone, preferably you first, but other people as well.
Well, you'll have to be specific about answering your question because I'm not sure I follow it. Are you skeptical of the government? And if that's the case, which government? The United States government? State government?
I'm speaking specifically about the United States government.
You know, we do deal with facts on the ground, and facts are incredibly important, and you don't get to opinions unless you have facts. So I'd like to know what facts you have.
In regards to surveillance?
Yes, what do you say?
Aside from the very specific programs that we know exist in terms of surveilling Arab and South Asian and Muslim communities.
And there is a fair, and I'm not speaking for all the litigation here, but there is a lot of litigation brought by wonderful organizations such as the ACLU and the like that are challenging these surveillance programs in court. And one of the advantages that litigation, that those kinds of litigation have, one of the advantages is that it brings this stuff out into the open. So you are right, we're always fighting on all fronts.
Right, I understand that. I guess I just wanted to sort of maybe think through on a different level or from a different perspective, like when we talk about free speech and what free means in that context, what does free speech mean in a context where the mechanism, the state, the government that is supposed to protect that speech is also part and parcel of the mechanism that is specifically surveilling people that are perceived as Muslim or read as South Asian or Arab? And that's, I guess, the question that I want us to think through.
I understand you a little bit better. Keep in mind that when you talk about the government, you've got to be specific. For example, if you're talking about the federal government, we have not only an executive branch, but we have Congress, and we have the federal judiciary, which is independent. And different branches do different kinds of things. So if there is a problem from a person's perspective with the executive branch, and some people have problems with it, you have possibly Congress to provide some sort of remedy. If you're in Congress, you hope that the federal judiciary, which so far has been independent, can deal with some of those problems because it is not politically accountable the way the president and Congress are. Now, I remember a saying a long time ago, I think Justice Stevens did it, but he borrowed it from somebody else. And I know where you're coming from. You cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just because there are problems with some of the branches of government, it does not follow that everything government does is to be disregarded and rejected and characterized as evil. Maybe this is a function of being around a little longer than you, but is that responsive at all?
I think that we're just about out of time. I might leave that as a rhetorical question. I know that Megan Carney wanted to say something quickly.
What I also hear in that question is rather than parsing out individual aspects of government, kind of thinking about government in a broader way. And I've heard affirmed a lot on this panel advocating for community response and meeting speech with more speech or meeting action with more action and some collective solidarity work that sort of doesn't necessarily include the government response, but thinking what do we need in order to meet these challenges, what do we need in order to survive under certain conditions. And I guess I just wanted, as a closing note, to say we're engaging, it's a complicated conversation, I'm glad you brought it up, and I think that the centers are each engaging with conversations like that in our own particular ways, and I wanted to invite everyone to, again, check out that table. There's a sanctuary, I mean, you're making me think about sanctuary cities and some of the debates we're having around what makes a sanctuary. Sanctuary dinner dialogue is happening at the Gender and Sexuality Center coming out. There's an invite out on the table. Other centers are kind of diving into exactly these questions. How do we proceed under the given circumstances that are so different for each of our communities, and yet be in solidarity with each other and recognize those shared issues. So I guess I just wanted to kind of bring it back
Yep.
to that. And hope
Thank you,
we can
Megan.
extend this conversation in other formats.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. government has a history of this kind of conduct in various different ways, but we also have a history of overcoming it, and the only reason that we have been able to overcome it and bring it out into the light is because of the First Amendment. So it has various sides to it, but and that I think goes back to the history point that Professor Nahmod made. So this was, as I said at the very beginning, the beginning of a conversation, the very, very beginning of one. But I appreciate your being here, and I hope that you will continue this conversation in a lot of different venues for the rest of the year and so forth. Thank you.